Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 74 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending October 27th, 2017, the Coming Home Tide 1-to-1 edition. In this episode, Jay Rosen and I return for a wide-ranging discussion of some of the top compliance and ethics-related stories for this week, including Hui Chen's commentary on the failings of ISO 37001 and Kristy Grant-Hart's response in the FCPA blog. Jay talks about the speech by DOJ Assistant Attorney General Rod Rosenstein about the DOJ working group to boost corporate cooperation. We discuss an article by Ben D. Pietro in the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Report about what is a compliance contagion. Jay walks us through how IBM uses big data in its FCPA compliance program. I talk about the Transparency International UK's new online tool to provide businesses with practical and in-depth guidance on tackling bribery and corruption. We take a look at a blog post by our friend and colleague Matt Kelly where it considers the intersection of compliance and sexual harassment. We note the Astros come home tied 1-1 with the Dodgers. We highlight the podcast from my monthly series this month, a 1 month to a more effective compliance program where we're focusing on 1 month to more effective compliance for business ventures. We hit some of the highlights of the Everything Compliance Episode 20 podcast, which was recorded live at SCCE 2017. Eric Feldman's coming through Houston next week to speak at Gerber. If you're in Houston, I hope you will join us. And finally, Jay Mea Culpa's getting out his overdue weekend report, so we have that to look forward to. The This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, back with my friend and colleague Jay Rosen for another episode of This Week in FCPA, episode 74 for the week ending October 27th, 2017, the Coming Home Tide edition, as the Astros return to Houston for games 3, 4, and 5 of the 2017 World Series, tied with the Los Angeles Dodgers 1-1. Jay, we are on pretty much a no-sleep buzz high here in Houston. How are things in Southern California?
Well, things in Southern California are always just a little bit more mellow. I'm thinking Game 2 was a bump in the road, and everyone here is definitely expecting a Game 6.
Well, I have to say I'm expecting a Game 6, but if we could close it out in Houston, I've told my wife we will not be sleeping this weekend, and our hearts may or may not be functioning, but we're going to give it a shot. So pretty exciting times, and for those who have been supporting teams that went a long time between World Series wins, I'm beginning to understand what you went through. So with that,
thank you, Tom.
Yes, I had a lot of comments from Red Sox fans in the end of Game 2. So they just said, enjoy the ride. So I'm enjoying it. But we had a lot of general anti-corruption news this week, Jay. So maybe we should just jump right into that. We started off on Sunday, I believe, with a very interesting blog post by Hui Chen on her site, Hui Chen Ethics, where she weighed in on ISO 37001. And as you know, Jay, I am not a fan of the standard, and we've talked about that on a prior podcast. But obviously, Hui Chen comes in with a former DOJ prosecutorial angle, former compliance officer in corporate America angle. So she has a lot of weight and authority. And she had I thought, some pretty searing critiques of 3701. And I think 2 days later in the FCPA blog, Kristy Grant also responded with her comments. Kristy is a fan of the standard, I think, as everyone knows. And she, that's Kristy Grant-Hart, I'm sorry. She published I would say it was intended to be a rejoinder, but I really don't think it answered the questions that Hui Chen raised. And then Henry Cutter over at the Risk and Compliance Journal of the Risk and compliance over at the Wall Street Journal kind of summarized both positions, and I found it to be a very interesting kind of dialogue back and forth. So you want to just give us your thoughts on that, Jay?
Yeah, well, I kind of tried to do a four-quadrant approach upon from which angle everyone's coming. And Hui seems to be talking more about a distinct lack of supporting data on how 37001 is going to be different than any other standard that's out there, because it seems to be lacking the data. In Kristy's article, she agreed with the fact that there's not enough data, but she said that the ISO 37001 is definitely based on best practices, and it is true that it's all, your accreditation is only going to be as good as that a party who's approving it. Cutter lined up two things, basically each side going against each other. And what I thought was interesting, Tom, is that you included an article that you wrote back in February of this past year. And I was glad to hear that your perspective hadn't changed, but the way that you took a look at it was all about doing the compliance. And I think if you take those four different points of view, we all want the same thing. We all want a standard that's meaningful, that companies can follow, and that will prevent corruption and prevent bribery. So it's not that we're so far apart. We all want the same things. I just think that there's different ways of getting there. And one of the points that came out about the ISO 37001 is that it is such a new standard that it is an absolute truth that there is not any corroborating data out there. So if we can, go out and look out into the marketplace a year and a half from now, hopefully there is some data. I'm not quite sure if the syllogism that Hui uses between 37001 and World Health Organization standard that has a desired effect. I understand conceptually where she goes from, but I think that might be some of the confusion too. So I don't know if what I said means anything, but that's the way I kind of placed it in its own four-quadrant approach.
So one of the things I think arguments raised by Hui Chen was to take a more rigorous look at measuring the results of the standard. And so on one hand, if you become 37001 certified and you hadn't engaged in bribery and corruption before, and you don't engage in bribery and corruption going forward, is that a result of receiving the certification? Is that a result of the actual individual prongs of the standard being followed, or is it just that your company doesn't engage in bribery and corruption? Kind of one issue. But the other issue there is a fairly or some amount of data on the effects of compliance programs on profitability. And certainly leading that discussion would be Ethisphere and their annual World's Most Ethical Company Awards, which they now have a body of 15 years of data and showed the financial returns of companies that have won the award have consistently been higher on average than the Standard & Poor's 500. But there's also been some academic work to look at the effects of internal controls and anti-corruption programs. So there is some data out there. I think we the compliance community may be struggling with a way to define what generally has been viewed as, if not legalistic, or more qualitative approaches to compliance. So I certainly applaud that discussion going forward. The other 2 points Hui Chen raised are things that I think I discussed back in February, but I think they bear repeating, Jay. And that's who's going to do the certification. If it's Kristy Grant-Hart, frankly, I have a high degree of comfort that she will do an adequate or to excellent job on performing a certification, no matter what the standards are. I know her. I know her work. I've read her books. I believe she knows what she's doing. If it's Joe's Crab Shack out there certifying 37001, I have less confidence. So the who question, I think, is important. The how question is equally important. The why question, that really goes to one other point that I don't think either of these commentators really touched on, Jay. Although Hui Chen talked about the Department of Justice would now outsource its responsibility to determine whether a compliance program was effective. But the result of receiving a certification would certainly be viewed by the company that receives it as positive. But for the company who contracts with them to be an agent, who contracts with them to be a subcontractor, who enters into discussions to become a joint venture partner, who enters into discussions to merge or acquire, if they accept the 37001 simply on face value, if a company has that certification and the counterparty does not perform their own independent investigation and something happens, the counterparty company really has no defense because relying on a company's 37001 certification is no more effective than relying on a company's trace certification, as we found out with Unioil. So the kind of why question, I think, for me, turns into a question about the business role, the business effect of having a 37001 certification. And if you're sitting across the table from a company who has a certification, no matter what the reason they got it for, whether it's a PR exercise or exercise to really take a look at the robustness of their compliance program, I think you still have to have your own independent assessment. And that's really where companies, counterparty companies in the business world need to tread very, very carefully. So, but the debate continues, and good to see kind of both sides this way. Kudos to Henry for kind of writing up both sides, and we'll have to see where that goes. Jay?
Yeah, I guess I would just want to throw one last thing in that I believe we got from our good friend President Reagan: trust but verify, correct? So even if somebody came and said they had the 37001, you would be remiss if you were considering a deal or an acquisition and didn't do your own due diligence. So I don't think it claims to take away the part or the onus of the party from doing diligence. It's just another choice that they've chosen, that the company has said, all right, well, I'm going to use as my anti-corruption standard 37001, but I could use the 10 hallmarks, or I could use, I think we should be happy as a community that people are trying to use standards at which to benchmark their operations to make sure that they are doing everything they can to combat corruption. So I think, that's another way to look at it. I don't think anybody's looking just to spend $30 or $40 or $50,000 just to get a logo next to their name, but I think they would like some actual benefit to accrue from the exercise.
Right. So, Jay, you picked up on a recent speech by Assistant Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, where I think he's talked about the DOJ's convened a working group to boost corporate cooperation with the department. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So this past Wednesday, the Deputy Attorney General gave the morning keynote address at the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform. And, over the past several years, the Chamber has been arguing for both compliance defense and trying to, just change the anti-corruption laws that are out there that the business community has to respond to. In the past, they've said that it puts U.S. companies at a considerable disadvantage. And the DAG gave some very interesting comments. And what was interesting from my perspective is he really took a good view of what is out there in terms of what do these regulations mean for people who are doing business? And he, first of all, at the beginning, quoted President Calvin Coolidge, who in 1925 famously declared that the chief business of the American people is business. And he likened the setup in the DOJ that if he, the Deputy Attorney General, was the chief operating officer, then the AG, Jeff Sessions, would be considered the CEO. And that they have a certain budget and a certain responsibility, but one of the things that they even have to respond to is uncertainty in the marketplace. And that's a lot of the times what we talk about in terms of how companies are going to respond to anti-corruption, what they're going to do, and there's uncertainty as into what your foreign counterparties are going to be doing, uncertainties to what the U.S. government is going to be doing. And, he argued that what they're trying to do is collect everything that's out there. So all the memos, all the guidance, and what they'd like to do is really compile it into one place. And at the same time, the DAG said that he's more of the mind that why take 3 sentences to say something when you can take one. So the remarks are pretty clear. I don't think it leaves anything to question. I think what we need to see as a compliance community is what they come back with. And I believe the president has said that for every new law that he wants to pass, he'd like to see 2 taken off the books. So we'll have to see how much we lose when that process goes through. But in the whole, I think it's remarks that would be appreciated by both the anti-corruption and the business community. What are your thoughts, Tom?
So one small point, Jay, he didn't say for every law that's passed he wanted 2 repealed. He said for every regulation passed, because the laws are passed by Congress, and that would presuppose Congress could do anything. So it's not laws, it's regulations.
That is a big error on my part. I apologize.
Right. So the regulations, of course, come from the regulatory bodies. In the FCPA world, it's actually primarily the Securities and Exchange Commission issues regulations. So I guess that real part of the speech just seemed to me to be pandering to the Chamber of Commerce. But the part that really got my attention was about the memos and the consolidation of memos, and really the tacit approval of the Yates memo. Now, of course, it wouldn't surprise us that Sessions would want the Yates memo redone simply to take Sally Yates' name off of it because she had the temerity to stand up to the president. But the Yates memo said we are going to prosecute individuals in appropriate circumstances, i.e. when they break the law. What we have seen since the release of the Yates memo in September 2017, at least in the FCPA world, is not a large increase in that. So I think that Rosenstein certainly is going to bring forward the concepts of the Yates memo. The individual prosecution of culpable individuals would be consistent, I think, with DOJ, at least philosophy over the past 15 years. The points in the Yates memo around credit, I think, were part of the FCPA pilot program from April 2016. I see those moving forward. If they will grant greater credit to companies, that could be done internally by the Department of Justice. The adding of a compliance defense, i.e. the amendment of the FCPA, that would require congressional approval, and that gets us back to the point where the current Congress can't seem to do anything. So I really doubt that they would move to having a compliance defense, but you certainly could see really consistent with DOJ policy, giving credit for companies who have a existing robust compliance program, who do self-disclose, who do cooperate extensively in the investigation, who do remediate. We have had numerous declinations granted this year, this calendar year, and I find those declinations to be fully consistent with existing DOJ policy and, frankly, consistent with what Rosenstein said he would like to see going forward. We've had declinations with disgorgement. I think we had 2 in June, and that's certainly consistent with the FCPA pilot program, and we could see that going forward as well. So I really saw, once again, except for the pandering, maybe that's consistent too, that the DOJ panders to the Chamber of Commerce when they get in front of them, just like they would to any other constituency. But the comments around the policy making would, at least in the FCPA world, really be maybe clarification, but certainly one could see almost a straight line from as far back as 2008 with 0804 and the opinion release, and coming forward, 0402 opinion release coming forward about what the DOJ expects companies to have in terms of a robust compliance program and giving appropriate credit. Remember, the pilot program only put in writing what the DOJ was doing, because if you look at the HP and the Parker Drilling FCPA enforcement actions, the companies received significant credit below the minimum sentencing guidelines because of the extensive remediation they engaged in, the extensive cooperation, even though neither company had self-disclosed. So the DOJ was already giving credit to companies really below the minimum suggested range of the sentencing guideline. But if the DOJ can put kind of all of these things in one memo, that's certainly going to help the compliance community. Anything which would clarify or give us information about the Department of Justice's thinking of how they would prosecute a case is, I think, a welcome addition. And I would be quite interested to see what they come up with. And if they're going to really implement the political philosophy, or at least the prosecutorial philosophy behind the Yates memo of going after individuals rather than corporations, I think that that's something the DOJ said they wanted to do and will do going forward.
Yeah, there also to add to that point, I believe there was some questioning yesterday of potential new representatives to be SEC commissioners.
Yes.
And they were being asked specifically those questions, in light of our favorite book, The Chicken Shit Club, and would they be willing to go after individuals as opposed to corporations? So that is still going to be, an idea that's out there, and it's something that we are all interested in the answer for. Next up on our list, Tom, our good friend Ben DiPietro at the Wall Street Journal Risk and Compliance Report takes a look at compliance contagion. And what does he have to say about that?
Well, compliance contagion is a really interesting concept that deals with the following, Jay, which is if you are in an industry where a very large negative reputational event occurs, that event could bleed over to you. So I really noticed this back in the Volkswagen scandal, because in Germany, it damaged the German national brand of quality. So other German automakers were not able to or were negatively impacted. And I recall the head, the president of the German Steel Manufacturers Trade Association said, first of all, this is not fair. We shouldn't be everybody painted with the same brush as Volkswagen. And fair or not really doesn't come into the matter. But what intrigued me more was his second point. He says that the response, the answer, the protection you have is transparency and compliance. So he was identifying two key components of a corporate compliance program. One is to have one, and two, to be transparent so that you can show it's working if and when such an event occurs. But the one that really you can name the scandal, and even think about Harvey Weinstein, that is really across multiple industries in terms of sexual harassment by members of senior management. But the other scandal that is certainly contagion right now is the Kobe Steel scandal in Japan, because one of the key marketing points for Japanese steel was simply that it was, if not the best, one of the best in the world. And compared to China, it was certainly much better than Chinese steel. And so made in Japan was supposed to be an indicia of quality. And now we have the situation where not only is there no indicia of quality, we have falsified certification records. And that negatively impacts every company that used Kobe Steel products across the globe. And what happens if you're a Japanese steel manufacturer? Are you now going to be called into account as well? So I was really glad that Ben wrote that article. It's something that I've been seeing for some time. And the response is the protection you have as a company is that you have a robust compliance program, that you have an ethical culture, and that all of that is transparent. So if we looked at Harvey Weinstein, you could say your senior management had not engaged in sexual harassment. The board had not approved multiple settlements of multi-million dollars, or in the case of Fox News, a $32 million settlement for Bill O'Reilly some few months before he signs a new contract with the company. I think something that companies are going to have to face in the FCPA world. If we drill down a little bit there, Jay, it led to things called industry sweeps, where companies in one industry, such as energy, the DOJ went and swept through them and found multiple FCPA violations. That then happened in pharmaceutical and tech. We've had country sweeps. Certainly Brazil is foremost among those countries where U.S. companies doing business in Brazil have found themselves under FCPA scrutiny because of the acts of their competitors. China is another country. So that type of contagion is, I think, going to become more prevalent, certainly in the social media reality of 2017 going forward.
I think another interesting point about the article is it runs down a checklist of things for you to consider in terms of whether or not your specific business or area is open to crisis contagion. And then they even talk about what your response should be within the media and social media. So it almost gets down to a similar situation that there's always that FCPA calculus about, does it make sense to approach the government and tell them what you've got, or is it an isolated incident? So there's always some type of calculus at work in terms of when you disclose and when you don't. So that's also another interesting part of that article. Next up is we've got an article from Global Investigations Review, and it's talking about how IBM is using big data and FCPA compliance. And this is one instance on some technology that IBM built for themselves, and another instance is using their mastermind computer, Watson. But IBM has been deploying machine learning to vast reams of data available to the company to spot red flags. And one example they gave is that they were able to provide a scenario of an employee who racked up $500 in taxi and $400 in restaurant expenses on a trip to Vegas. So at that point, that would generate a couple red flags, and then they would be able to have historical information on the employee, and plus they would also be able to benchmark against other employees in IBM who had taken similar customers to Las Vegas. So that's one way that they can scan the data, but then they also have learning tools that also allow them to analyze unstructured data. And basically the example that was given was the tool could spot how the employee was talking to a client and a government official who also was in Las Vegas at the same time. So basically, the computer had gone through all the big data and found a noise pattern that would require further looking into. So these are concepts that we've heard about tangentially in the marketplace about how to use AI. And I believe at one conference or one session I was at the conference last week in Vegas, they actually talked about the potential for delivering just-in-time FCPA messaging. So if you were booking with your travel company and you were booking a Vegas trip and it was in conjunction with a certain conference, that you could get delivered 3 messages, and one saying, hope you have a successful trip to Vegas. Please recall that you have certain gift and entertainment limits within your budget and respect them. And, numbers 3, have a safe trip. So this is a little bit of Big Brother combining with red flags and, again, giving companies more guidance on where to look for potential trouble.
So Patrick Taylor, the CEO of Oversight Systems, calls this finding patterns in raked leaves. And I certainly think that it's going to be the wave of the future. Absolutely agree that you can deliver a just-in-time FCPA message exactly really as you've detailed. I've thought about that. I've written about that. I've talked about that. And the more information you can get more quickly in real time, even that gives you the opportunity to maybe nip something in the bud before it goes from a code of conduct or compliance or corporate policy violation to a full-blown FCPA violation. So a very interesting article, and certainly I think one of the waves of the future, Jay.
So now we've got another tool that's been introduced to the marketplace from Transparency International's United Kingdom branch. Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah, TI UK has put up together a very, very, very good resource on their kind of thoughts on best practices for a compliance program. It's guidance. It's puts together international best practices. It's a tool that they've been working on for some time. It incorporates thinking around the UK Bribery Act, the FCPA, ISO 37001, and it's a pretty cool tool. I've checked it out. They've got a series of categories that you can get not only information about what goes in each category, but also some formats you can use. So kudos to TI UK for putting it together. We've linked to an article written by Rory Donaldson of TI UK that he wrote for FCPA Blog. And in that article, it links to the new tool. So if you want to check it out, I would urge you to do so.
And what's on Matt Kelly's mind this week?
Well, one of the things that was on his mind is what's been on the mind of lots of us, including myself, Jay, and you, which is the Harvey Weinstein scandal. And it continues to reverberate. We hinted about it earlier. Now it's gone really across outside the entertainment industry to other industries as well, where senior management really was engaged in sexual harassment, created a culture which allowed it to flourish. And Matt kind of reviews those, but then takes a look at what companies can do. And most interestingly, he cited to the Texas Health Resources, which was recently named by Fortune as the best workplace in the United States for women. So, certainly as a Texan, I was proud of that. Stunned that the state of Texas government would do anything positive for women, but still, apparently they're doing so. But here's what they've done, which is what I think the Weinstein scandal is going to lead the discussion on. The chief people officer of the Texas Health Resources said that employees are always expected to report harassment when they see it, even if they aren't personally involved. Managers, in turn, must report the allegations to HR. If they don't, then they're part of the problem. And that's what I see as the dynamic change in the conversation around reporting and actually what reporting will be going forward. No longer is it simply the woman who was harassed's responsibility to raise her hand, to go to HR, to report the violations. It's now the person who's aware of it. And I think that's a huge sea change. If we can get that change inculcated in corporate America, it will go a long way towards eradicating not only this type of behavior, but frankly, multiple types of illegal or violated nefarious conduct. Because here's the thing, Jay, everybody knows. You've been in the corporate world. You've been in a variety of different types of corporations. I come out of the law firm world and corporate world in Houston. And in both of the worlds I was in, everybody knew who the harassers are. Everybody who the harassers were. And but nobody who was not directly affected ever raised their hand and said, this is wrong, this has got to stop. So using the Texas Health Resources as a model, Matt's identified a way that companies can actually move forward on this. So by using complaint hotlines to force managers to take sexual harassments seriously. So you can tie managers' performance to that. You can tie individual employees' performance to that, and you can really drive a change in behavior. So kudos to Matt for identifying that, and it's something that I'm certainly going to continue to talk about in the compliance community and compliance world as well.
He's got a great meme in his article, and it's Gary Cole from Office Space, and it says, if you could just never speak up at all, that would be great.
Yeah. So. I think Dilbert echo that.
Yeah. So next, we've spoken about the Astros. You're hopeful about them closing it out at home in Houston. What's happening on your monthly podcast, Tom?
So this month we are wrapping up the final week of 1 month. This month's 1 month to a more effective compliance program has been 1 month to more effective compliance for business ventures. And it's been a really interesting exploration. This week we've looked at different types of business relationships, franchising, distributors, teaming partners, strategic alliances, and how, because they are different in the business context, you may need a different compliance risk management response. So it's been a great exploration sponsored by Mike Volkov and the Volkov Law Group. Shout out to us, Jay, because we posted our first live podcast as the formal Everything Compliance Gang. Our first podcast was in SCCE's 2016 CEI, and that really led us to form the Everything Compliance Podcast Gang. But we recorded a podcast at Las Vegas. We had Roy Snell sitting in for Mike Volkov, who is currently on assignment somewhere. And it was a lot of fun, and I think all of us really enjoyed that podcast in particular. And I got that posted on Thursday, and of course that's linked to the show notes. And one more thing, Jay, your affiliated monitor colleague, Eric Feldman, speaking in Houston next week. So if you're in Houston, check out the Gerber website. That's ghber.org. Eric speaking on Thursday, November 2nd. If you'd like some details, it'll be in the show notes. And if you have any questions, you can certainly give me a shout or a call. But we're extraordinarily pleased to have Eric Feldman down here to talk to us about proactive monitoring and how companies can take advantage of that for their compliance program. So last week, we had a hint of a Rosen weekend report. I don't know if I didn't get the memo, but I don't recall seeing one. So I was wondering if we might see one this weekend.
Yeah, I think I owe everyone last week. So I will try to get that up over the weekend, in addition to worrying how the Patriots are going to fare without Dante Hightower. And also one of my favorite cousins, Merle, is coming in from Chicago. So she's going to get to meet Eminem and Rebecca. So I'm looking forward to a weekend of football and family and blog writing.
Well, excellent. Well, Jay, as always, it's been a ton of fun. So you want to take us home this week?
I'd love to. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors, we'd like to thank you for joining us for This Week in FCPA for the week ending October 27, 2017. Thanks so much for listening and have a wonderful weekend.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you again for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions, you can email me at Tom Fox, I am Tom Fox, at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. And you can email Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitors, at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only weekly FCPA Compliance and Ethics Roundup in the podcast world. Also, I hope you will join us next week when Jay and I return for another episode of This Week in FCPA. This Week in FCPA is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.